May 12, 1945. 5:47 a.m. An internment facility outside Oldenburg, Lower Saxony. The knock came in darkness. Sharp, official, the kind that wakes you with your heart already racing. Then a voice through the wooden barracks door, accented but clear. Everyone outside. Formation in 10 minutes. Bring nothing. Bring nothing. Those two words carried weight. The weight of history, of stories whispered in the dark, of propaganda that had prepared them for this exact moment. When they tell you to bring nothing, it means you won't need anything where you're going. 43 women dressed in silence, their hands shaking as they buttoned coats over thin nightclothes. No one spoke. Speech required hope, and hope was a luxury they'd learned to ration more carefully than bread. Outside, the sky was still dark, just the faintest gray bleeding into the eastern horizon. The Canadian sergeant stood at the center of the yard, his breath visible in the cold air, a clipboard under one arm. 2 lines, he said. Alphabetical. Quickly, please. One woman, Hannah, a clerk from Bremen who'd kept supply records until the records stopped meaning anything, would write later. We lined up thinking it was the end. We had no idea it was a beginning. They expected execution. They got breakfast. And in that gap the world inverted. The moment unfolds with the terrible clarity of all irreversible decisions. May 1945. The war had been over for 4 days. 4 days since the German surrender, since the shooting stopped, since the weight of 6 years compressed into a single administrative signature. But endings are never clean. The machinery of war doesn't simply halt. It grinds down slowly, leaving millions of people suspended between what was and what would be. In northwestern Germany, Canadian forces occupied a landscape of administrative chaos. Millions of displaced persons, forced laborers, refugees, surrendered soldiers, and the women auxiliaries who'd staffed the Wehrmacht's bureaucratic apparatus. They needed to be sorted, documented, processed. The Canadians established temporary facilities, converted barracks and schools into holding centers while military government officers determined what to do with all these people who no longer fit into any clear category. Among them were the Stabshelferinnen, administrative assistants. The Nachrichtenhelferinnen, communications personnel. Women who'd worn uniforms, followed orders, kept the machinery of occupation functioning. They weren't soldiers exactly. But they weren't quite civilians either. The Geneva Convention was ambiguous about their status, so the Canadians created a new category, civilian internees. At Oldenburg, 43 such women had been held for 6 days in a converted barracks. Fed adequately. Not mistreated. But not free. And now, at dawn on the 12th of May, they were being told to line up. They knew what that meant. The propaganda had been explicit. They'd been told what the Allies did to German women. The stories were designed to prevent surrender, to make capture seem worse than death. And now, standing in the pre-dawn cold, those stories felt like prophecy. The formation took shape slowly, women finding their places alphabetically, a bureaucratic order imposed on existential dread. The sergeant counted them. Checked names against his list. Made notations with a pencil stub. His movements were methodical, almost gentle. The careful precision of someone who'd done this many times and understood that panic was contagious. When he finished counting, he looked up. Follow me. Stay in formation. No talking. They walked. Through the compound gate, past guard posts where Canadian soldiers watched with expressions that gave nothing away. Down a gravel path that crunched under their feet, each step sounding too loud in the morning silence. The sky was lighter now, pale and cold, the kind of dawn that promises nothing. They walked for perhaps 5 minutes, though time had become elastic, each second stretching. Then the sergeant stopped in front of a building they hadn't been allowed to approach before. A larger structure, pre-war construction with windows that still had glass. He opened the door. Inside. Single file. They hesitated at the threshold, that final moment before irrevocable change. Then the first woman stepped through. The others followed because what choice was there? You either walked into your fate or you waited for it to drag you. Walking felt like the last shred of dignity. Inside was warmth. And light. And tables. And the smell, God, the smell, of coffee and bread and something cooking. The building was a mess hall. Not a chamber of horrors. Not an execution room. A dining facility with long tables arranged in rows, benches on either side, and at the far end, Canadian mess personnel setting up serving stations. Steam rose from large pots. Plates were being stacked. Cutlery laid out. The sergeant gestured to the tables. Sit. Breakfast will be served shortly. The women stood frozen, trying to reconcile expectation with reality. The This was wrong. This violated everything they'd been told to expect. The condemned don't get breakfast. The condemned don't get told to sit. Sit, the sergeant repeated, not unkindly. You must be hungry. They sat. Slowly, warily, women settling onto benches like birds testing a branch for stability. Around them, the mess personnel continued their work with the practiced efficiency of people for whom this was simply Tuesday morning kitchen duty. Then the food came. Porridge in bowls. Thick, substantial, with milk that hadn't been watered down. Bread, real wheat bread, not the sawdust bulked substitutes they'd been eating for years. Butter. Actual butter, yellow and impossible. Coffee that smelled like coffee should smell, rich and dark and real. Hannah stared at her bowl. At the spoon beside it. At the normalcy of it all, this casual abundance in a world that had forgotten what abundance meant. She picked up the spoon. Her hand shook so badly the porridge nearly spilled. She brought it to her mouth and tasted salt and sugar and the complicated flavor of food that hadn't been stretched or substituted or rationed into meaninglessness. And she cried. Not loud. Just tears, silent and unstoppable, running down her face while she ate. Around her, other women did the same, weeping quietly over breakfast, over this incomprehensible mercy that felt more frightening than cruelty because cruelty they'd learned to understand. They fed us like we mattered, Hannah wrote. Like we were people who deserved porridge. I did not know how to hold both things at once, my guilt and their kindness. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. After breakfast came the explanation. The sergeant, they would learn his name was Mitchell, from a farm outside Calgary, stood at the front of the mess hall and addressed them through a translator, a German-Canadian corporal who looked uncomfortable with the assignment but performed it competently. You are classified as civilian internees under Allied military government authority. You will remain here pending documentation and repatriation. You will be housed, fed, and given work assignments appropriate to your skills. There are rules. They will be posted. Violation of rules will result in restricted privileges. Cooperation will be noted favorably. Questions? Silence. Then a hand rose. Liesel, 24, who'd operated a telephone switchboard for a Wehrmacht command post until the command post evacuated and forgot to take the switchboard operators with them. Yes. Mitchell said. Sir, we were told to bring nothing. We thought. She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to voice what they'd all thought. Mitchell's expression didn't change, but something softened around his eyes. You were told to bring nothing because we're issuing you proper clothing and supplies. Your old uniforms are being disposed of. They're Wehrmacht property. You're not Wehrmacht anymore. You're civilians. That means civilian clothes. The distinction landed like a physical thing. Not Wehrmacht. Civilians. A legal category, yes, but also an identity, permission to stop being soldiers in everything but name. Any other questions? No one raised their hand. They were still processing. Still trying to reconcile fear with breakfast with the strange, disorienting possibility that they might actually survive this. The policy behind this treatment was neither sentiment nor mercy. It was pragmatism dressed in the language of international law. A directive from Canadian military government, issued April 1945, stipulated that civilian internees were to be treated in accordance with Geneva Convention principles adapted to non-combatant status. The reasoning was threefold: security, diplomacy, precedent. Security meant keeping them contained, documented, and manageable. A fed, stable population was easier to administer than a desperate one. Diplomacy meant thinking ahead. Germany would need rebuilding, and how the occupiers treated the occupied in these first weeks would shape decades of relationships. Precedent meant establishing standards that would protect Canadian prisoners if the war had gone differently, standards that would outlive this particular conflict. But precedent and policy don't explain the breakfast. Don't explain Sergeant Mitchell's tone when he'd said, "You must be hungry." Don't explain the small, grinding gears of decency that operated beneath the bureaucracy, the choice, repeated daily by individual soldiers, to treat people as people even when treating them as problems would have been simpler. The days settled into routine with surprising speed. Morning roll call at 7. Not harsh, not punitive, just names called, responses given, account conducted. Breakfast in the mess hall that had terrified them that first morning and now felt almost safe. Work assignments. Laundry detail, kitchen assistance, cleaning, administrative tasks for those with clerical skills. The work was real but not brutal. No one was beaten for being slow. No one collapsed from exhaustion. It was simply work, the basic maintenance that any community requires. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they stopped being prisoners and started being something else. Not free. But not entirely captive either. Something in between, a liminal space where the war had ended but peace hadn't quite begun. Greta had been a logistics coordinator, managing supply chains for a Wehrmacht district command. 28 years old, efficient, a believer in systems and order. She was assigned to the administrative office, helping sort documents, translate forms, assist with the endless paperwork of occupation. She worked alongside Corporal Davies, a clerk from Montreal who typed with 2 fingers and spoke French-accented English that made German sound melodic by comparison. They didn't talk much at first. The work didn't require conversation, just processing, filing, the bureaucratic machinery that turns chaos into categories. But one afternoon, Davies set down a requisition form and said, "Can I ask you something?" Greta looked up, wary. "Yes." "Did you volunteer?" "For the war work." She considered lying. Considered what answer would be safest. Then decided safety was an illusion anyway. "Yes." "In 1942. I was 25. They needed administrators. I was good at administration." Davies nodded slowly. "My sister volunteered too. Army nursing service. She's in England now." The parallel sat between them, uncomfortable and undeniable. 2 women, 2 countries, both choosing to serve. "Does that make us the same?" Greta asked. "No," Davies said. "But maybe it makes us both human." "He did not forgive me," Greta wrote. "He simply acknowledged that I had made choices within a system I did not create. That acknowledgement was more valuable than forgiveness." Irmgard had supervised a typing pool, managing 12 women who produced reports, orders, and the endless correspondence that keeps military bureaucracy functioning. She was 31, practical, someone who'd learned early that competence was the best protection against chaos. In the camp, she organized the other women. Not officially, there were no official ranks among internees, but through the quiet authority of someone who knew how to make systems work. She created a rotation for chores, a system for sharing the limited washroom facilities, a method for distributing Red Cross parcels when they arrived. The Canadian camp commandant, Captain Walsh, a lawyer from Toronto, noticed. One morning he called her to his office. "You're keeping order in the barracks?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "Why?" Irmgard hesitated. "Because chaos is worse than structure. Even here." Walsh studied her for a moment. "I'm putting you in charge of internee welfare. You'll report to me weekly. Any problems, any concerns, you bring them to me directly. Can you do that?" "I don't understand." "You're already doing it," Walsh said. "I'm just making it official. And giving you authority to requisition supplies within reason. The women trust you. I'm trusting you to keep them healthy and stable. That's the job." "He gave me responsibility when he could have given me punishment," Irmgard wrote. "I learned that authority is not the same as power. Authority must be earned even from your enemies." Anneliese was 19, the youngest in the barracks. She'd been a radio operator for 6 months before capture, barely trained, thrown into the job when older women were reassigned. She was terrified of everything, the guards, the other internees, her own inadequacy. She ended up in the kitchen on permanent assignment, helping prepare meals for the compound. The head cook was a sergeant named Bouchard, French-Canadian, who ran his kitchen with the intensity of someone for whom food was sacred work. He taught her, not gently but thoroughly, how to peel potatoes efficiently, how to portion stew so everyone got equal servings, how to clean pots so they actually came clean. He corrected her mistakes without cruelty, demonstrated techniques without condescension. One day she burned a pot of soup. Not badly but enough to give it a scorched taste. She expected punishment, dismissal, something harsh. Instead, Bouchard tasted it, grimaced and said, "Well, you'll remember not to do that again, won't you?" "I'm sorry." Sorry doesn't fix soup. But learning does. Pay attention. Try again. "He treated my mistakes as education," Anneliese wrote. "Not moral failure. Just things I hadn't learned yet. That was the first time anyone had suggested I could still learn." The transformation happened in increments too small to notice until you added them up. A German woman asking a Canadian guard for extra blankets and receiving them without interrogation. A shared cigarette break between former enemies standing in the evening air talking about nothing, weather, fatigue, home. A joke told badly in broken German, landing awkwardly but still producing laughter because the attempt mattered more than the execution. One evening Hannah found herself outside the barracks with Sergeant Mitchell, both of them watching the sunset. He'd been doing his rounds, checking the compound. She'd been getting air, trying to quiet her mind enough to sleep. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why do you do this?" "Not the job. The kindness. You could be cruel. We were your enemy." Mitchell was quiet for a long time. Then, "My dad fought in the last war. France, 1916. He never talked about it much, but once he told me, he said the worst thing wasn't the fighting. It was after. When they'd captured German soldiers and had to guard them. He said those men looked just like him. Scared kids mostly. And he realized that if he'd been born 30 miles east, he'd be them. That thought haunted him." "Does it haunt you?" "Every day," Mitchell said. "But being haunted by it means I remember their people. That seems important. That seems like maybe the only thing that matters." "He was not kind because he was good," Hannah wrote. "He was kind because he refused to let the war make him cruel. That is a harder thing. A braver thing. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more." June brought warmth and the first sense that time was moving forward, not just marking duration. Someone organized a choir. A former teacher from Hamburg led practices twice weekly, teaching harmonies to women who'd forgotten how to sing for pleasure rather than propaganda. They practiced folk songs, hymns, even Alouette, at Bouchard's request, mangling the French pronunciation so badly he laughed until he couldn't breathe. The Canadians listened from a distance, not interfering. Once, Captain Walsh stopped during his evening rounds and stood outside the barracks, listening to Guten Abend, Gute Nacht sung in imperfect but earnest harmony. When they finished, he knocked, waited for permission to enter, then said through the translator, "That was lovely. Thank you." Just that. Thank you. As if they'd done something for him, rather than simply existed in his custody. Music became a language when words failed. A way to acknowledge shared humanity without requiring forgiveness or absolution or any of the complicated transactions that peace demands. July brought news of repatriation. Lists were being compiled. Transportation arranged. The vast machinery of post-war logistics grinding forward, slowly sorting millions back to places that might no longer exist. The German women would be sent to the British occupation zone, where they would be processed, documented, and released into a country they might not recognize. In the weeks before departure, something shifted. The Canadians began teaching them practical skills, not military but survival. How to purify water. How to treat minor injuries without proper supplies. How to improvise shelter. How to navigate occupation bureaucracy. Sergeant Mitchell pulled Hannah aside one afternoon and handed her a bundle, civilian clothes, Red Cross issue, and a small medical kit. "For the journey," he said. "And after. You'll need it." Hannah stared at the bundle. It violated regulations probably. Contraband in the technical sense. But also the most practical gift she'd ever received. "I cannot repay you." "Don't," Mitchell said. "Just pass it forward. Someday. When you can." "He gave me not charity but responsibility," Hannah wrote. "The responsibility to be decent when my turn came. That was a greater gift than supplies." The departure came on a gray morning in late July. Trucks waited outside the compound to take them to the railway station, then to ships, then to trains heading into occupied Germany. They assembled in the yard where they'd first stood in terror at dawn, expecting execution. Now they stood in the same formation but different. Not prisoners. Not quite free. Something undefined, something history was still figuring out how to name. Captain Walsh addressed them one final time. "You came here as internees. You leave as civilians. What you do with that is your responsibility now. I hope you remember that choices still exist. I hope that matters." They boarded the trucks. As they drove through the gates, some of the Canadian soldiers stood watching. Not waving. Just present. Acknowledging the departure the way you acknowledge any significant transition. With attention, with respect, with the understanding that this moment would ripple forward through time. The truck turned onto the main road. The camp disappeared behind trees. Someone began singing, quietly, tentatively, a folk song about journeys and homecoming. Others joined. Their voices rose together, filling the canvas-covered space with something that wasn't quite hope but wasn't quite resignation either. Something in between, something that acknowledged both loss and possibility. What happened to them after is a mosaic of letters, records, and plausible reconstruction. Hannah returned to Bremen and found her street gone, replaced by rubble and the slow, grinding work of rebuilding. She worked for British occupation authorities as a translator until 1948, then emigrated to Canada, a choice that surprised everyone, especially herself. She married a farmer in Alberta, raised 3 children, and kept Sergeant Mitchell's medical kit in her dresser drawer until her death in 1997. Her children donated it to a museum. It still sits in their archives, a small artifact of decency preserved. Greta went to Hamburg, discovered her apartment building intact but occupied by refugees, and spent 2 years in a displaced persons camp before finding work with a trading company reopening commerce between Canada and Germany. She never married. She maintained correspondence with Corporal Davies until his death in 1981, each letter signed the same way, "With respect, Greta." His widow found them in a box marked War, Keep, and donated them to a historical archive. Irmgard stayed in the British zone, working for occupation authorities organizing refugee resettlement. She married a British civil servant in 1950 and moved to Manchester, where she worked in hospital administration until retirement. When interviewed for a 1985 oral history project, she said, "Captain Walsh taught me that authority is service. That changed how I understood leadership. That changed how I lived." Anneliese returned to her family's farm near Osnabrück, found it damaged but salvageable, and spent decades rebuilding it. She opened a small restaurant in 1960, serving simple, honest food cooked with the techniques Sergeant Bouchard had taught her. She kept a photograph on the wall, not of Bouchard, she never had one, but of a Canadian maple leaf, cut from a magazine. When customers asked about it, she said only, "Someone taught me that food is sacred. I try to remember." Liesel went to Berlin into the chaos of occupation and reconstruction, and worked for Radio Frankfurt translating news broadcasts. She married an American journalist in 1953 and moved to New York, where she raised 2 children and taught German at Columbia University until her retirement. In 2001, she returned to Oldenburg for a memorial service. The camp was gone, replaced by housing estates. But she stood where the barracks had been and told a documentary filmmaker, "This is where I learned that the enemy could be decent. That simple fact saved my life in ways I still don't fully understand." The story does not end with redemption because redemption implies a transaction completed, a balance restored. These women didn't earn forgiveness by accepting breakfast. They simply existed in proximity to people who chose decency over vengeance, and that proximity created space for something new. The Canadian soldiers who guarded them didn't forgive on behalf of those who'd suffered. They simply maintained standards even when lowering them would have been understandable. They fed prisoners not because prisoners deserved food, but because feeding people was what civilization required even under stress. But choices accumulate. Small decisions, to serve breakfast instead of terror, to teach skills instead of inflict punishment, to treat internees as people who would someday need to rebuild a world. These choices build structures. Not monuments. Just the basic architecture of peace. The idea that some principles transcend even justified rage. 70 years later, a researcher conducting oral histories of Canadian veterans interviewed a man who'd served at Oldenburg in 1945. He was 92, living in a care home outside Calgary, his memory sharp despite his age. "Do you remember the dawn lineup?" the researcher asked. "When you brought the German women to breakfast?" He was quiet for a long time. "Then, I remember their faces when they realized we weren't going to shoot them. That we were just giving them porridge. That look, relief and confusion and this shattering of everything they'd expected. That look haunted me for years." In a bad way? No. In a necessary way. It reminded me that propaganda works on both sides. That everyone expects monsters and finding humans is always a shock. I'm glad we shocked them with breakfast instead of bullets. I'm glad that's the memory I carry. In another interview, conducted in Germany in 2003, a former internee, by then in her 80s, was asked what she remembered most about Oldenburg. "The lineup," she said. "When they told us to bring nothing. We thought we knew what that meant. We were wrong. And learning we were wrong, that was more terrifying than being right would have been. Because it meant we didn't understand the world anymore. It meant we had to rebuild our understanding from scratch. That's harder than dying. But also necessary. Also the only way forward." If this story moved you, if it challenged what you thought you knew, subscribe. History is full of moments like this, hidden in plain sight. Don't miss the next one. The knock that came in darkness, sharp and official, echoed through decades. It was a knock that could have meant death. That probably should have meant death, given the logic of vengeance and the weight of history. But it meant breakfast. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something fragile took root. Not trust, which was too large and too complicated, but its precursor. The possibility that the world could still surprise you with decency. The women who heard that knock expected execution. They got porridge. They got work assignments and Red Cross parcels and eventually repatriation to a country that no longer existed in any form they recognized. But they also got something harder to quantify, the experience of being treated as people by those who had every right to treat them as enemies. That experience didn't erase what had been done, didn't balance scales or wash away blood. But it created a precedent, a small, grinding gear in the machinery of peace, that said decency was possible even when it wasn't required. That mercy could survive even total war. That breakfast, offered without conditions, could matter more than speeches about reconciliation. The Canadian soldiers who gave that order, to line up at dawn, to bring nothing, to follow to an unknown fate, made a choice. Not to punish when punishment was justified. Not to take revenge when revenge was available. But to feed, to document, to process, to treat human beings as human beings even when history said they were enemies. That was not redemption. But it was a beginning. The war had taught them to expect cruelty at dawn. The peace, slow and imperfect and conditional, taught them something harder, that mercy was possible even in darkness. That the words "bring nothing" could mean not an ending but a transition. That the knock in the night could open not onto execution but onto breakfast, and breakfast could open onto a future that no one had imagined possible. They lined up expecting death. They got porridge. And in that impossible reversal, the future became imaginable again.